Hi, Pastor. Having the right tool and using it correctly are two different things. You want to find out what settings to use on your DSLR camera? Stick around and you'll find out. The first setting we want to look at is frame rate. Now, what is your frame rate? Well, your frame rate is the number of frames or pictures your camera is taking every second. Now, a very fast frame rate means very, very smooth motion. Very slow frame rate or low frame rate, like if you only get one picture a second, everything's going to seem very jerky. You're going to look like Robot Man. So that's going to be important. Now, is faster always better? Well, actually, it's not. You can have a frame rate that's too fast and it doesn't quite feel right. Now, why is this? Well, because we're accustomed to watching video in two different frame rates. So the first is 24 frames per second is what we get in a movie theater. Now, when you're watching something at 24 frames rate, the movement looks fairly smooth, so that seems to be okay. But it feels like a movie in a way that is kind of subconscious, but it just seems high quality. We're also used to watching television, which is shot at 30 frames per second. And television, although it's a faster frame rate, because we've always associated with television with less quality than movies, it feels lower quality. It's bizarre, it's strange, but it's a fact. 30 frames per second doesn't quite feel the same way as 24 frames per second. So what we're talking about here is subtle psychological differences. And you need to decide on what you're going to be going for, whether it's going to be more the film or the TV. 24 frames per second feels more professional and more dramatic, where 30 frames per second maybe seems a little bit more real. The next thing we want to look at is shutter speed. Now, when you're using a slow shutter speed, things that are in motion will seem blurry. So take a look at these race cars. The one image is using a slow shutter speed, and so the race cars are looking blurry. Now, that's not necessarily bad because it communicates that they're going fast. If you use a fast shutter speed, things that are in motion will be frozen in time. So when we're looking at our natural eyes don't exactly have a frame rate, but they kind of do as well. And our natural eyes are kind of a compromise between this slow and fast. When we're using shutter speeds that are too slow, things in your video are going to look out of focus. But when we use speeds that are too fast, the video is actually going to look jittery. And the reason is just take a look at your hand and move it in front of your face. There's a natural blurring that takes place with your natural eyes when things are moving quickly. But when the frame rate is having things frozen in time, you're not seeing that natural blur. What you're seeing is a whole bunch of still images. And so a frame rate that's too fast actually doesn't look smoother, it looks jerkier. So we want to find that sweet spot. Now, the way to find that sweet spot, to have the most natural looking video, is to use a shutter speed that is double your frame rate. So if you're using 24 frames per second, then you want 1/50th of a second for your shutter speed. If you're using 30 frames per second for your frame rate, then you want 1/60th a second for your shutter speed. So whatever your selection for your frame rate is, your shutter speed should be double that, and that will look just right. Next thing you want to look at is the aperture. Now, this is one of the reasons why we use a DSLR rather than a video camera to shoot our videos, because we have control over the aperture. Now, the aperture, cameras have a pupil just like your eye. And aperture is the greater restriction that has, the less light that's going to go through. Now, in a camera, this is measured in f-stops, where the higher the f-stop, that means the more constriction of that pupil in the lens. What we want is ideally the lowest amount of constriction possible, so the widest lens, which is the lowest f-stop your camera will go. Now, having the lowest f-stop your camera will go will do two things. First of all, it's going to let more light in the lens because we're opening it up. And when you add more light into the lens, that allows you to be a little bit sharper. But also, when you have the lens open as wide as possible, you have less depth of field. Now, depth of field is your focal distance. When you've got a narrow aperture in your camera, things close and far away are sharp. Where if the aperture is wide, just the thing you're focusing on is in focus. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, take a look at these images here. When you look at this castle image, if you look at the one image, you're not sure what you're supposed to be focusing on because everything's in focus. Where the other image with the limited depth of field, you can tell the photographer wants you to look at the berries. So it's trying to focus you. When you look at an individual, when you have a large depth of field where everything's in focus, the image comes across as being cluttered because you can see everything in focus and your eye isn't always sure what it's supposed to be focusing on. But with that limited depth of field where only the speaker is in focus, you're not paying attention to the stuff and you know exactly what to focus on. So that control over depth of field actually increases people's ability to focus on you. And I mean, that's why you're shooting the video, is so that they'll focus on you and hear what you have to say. The next thing we want to focus on is the ISO. Now, your camera's ISO, that measures the light sensitivity setting on the camera's sensor. The higher the number, the greater the sensitivity, so you'll be able to shoot in much lower light conditions. But the higher number, also the grainier the image is. So what we want is actually as low as number as possible. So we want that lower, but when you're making adjustments, after you've already adjusted your shutter speed and everything else in your f-stop, what you're going to be doing is just looking at your camera until the darkness or lightness looks just about right. That's what you're going to be aiming for. Now, if you're still seeing that your ISO number is set at 800 or higher, what you're going to want to do is have brighter lights to light up the room a little bit better, because once you're getting, especially over 800, your image is going to be looking a little bit grainy. So that's the ISO setting. Set it manually so it looks not too dark, not too bright. And if that resulting image is higher than 800, then you're going to want to add extra light into the room to help that image be clear. With those simple settings, you should be fine as far as your camera settings go. The only thing that you might add is adjust the gain on your microphone you're using. Now, not all mics will allow you to do this. Sometimes you have to do this in post. But if you've got a microphone set up where you can adjust the microphone while you're shooting, what you want is not to be redlining. So when you say something loud and you bang, 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 and if it's hitting into that red, the gain is set too high. You want, when you say something loud, bang, 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 that it just goes into the yellow. That just gives you a wiggle room, because whenever it gets into the red, we call that clipping. It's going to create this vocal distortion kind of sound. It's going to sound lower quality and people are going to tune you out faster. Hopefully this helps you. Use the tools that you have.